these topics. Dr. Melvin Varghese is a clinical psychologist I already mentioned. He's also a podcaster, an expert in this field, and has wealth of experience that he's going to bring to us today. So, without further ado, uh, Dr. Varghese, please take it over.
Thank you so much, Mina. Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. All right. The team asked me how we should start, our conversation today. And I thought for the past couple of days, and it just so happened that our 5-year-old had, so every week in school, they send home the work that she's done, right? And so this was from this week. And normally as an Indian parent, my wife and I are both looking at like, what did she do 5 out of 5? Is there smiley faces, all of these things. But this week I looked on the back page and it says difficulty understanding concept, but in parentheses, not unusual for kids to struggle with this. And I thought to myself, but she's an Indian kid. She should not be struggling with this, right? And I joke about it, but I am so grateful we are having conversations like this because I remember I was telling the team I turned 42 yesterday, and that's double 21. And my life at 21 years old, I remember wanting to have these kind of conversations, especially among our Desi community, and just wondering, seeing a lot of things that people were sharing as I got older. And it's amazing that we get to have these conversations. So I will just do a very quick, brief intro about myself. I put together just a one-page document that Jay will share now with you all. So it has much more of this, but basically I'm a licensed psychologist. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but I'm actually a native Texan. I was born in Kerala. Our family immigrated in 1989 to the US and we settled in Dallas. We actually lived in Carrollton initially, then Louisville, and then Flower Mound. So my parents still live in Flower Mound. I did most of my schooling in Texas. So I did my bachelor's degree at Austin College. I did a PhD at TWU. And I moved to Nashville where I completed my pre-doctoral internship and my postdoctoral fellowship at Vanderbilt University. So I've been uh, I've had just an incredible opportunity. And in 2012, after I finished my postdoc, the plan was actually for me to stay at Vandy and working in the Department of Psychiatry as a clinical psychologist. But we got married and we were trying to figure out where to settle. My wife is an attorney and she does a very specific type of law. So we decided to settle here in Philly, and that is what brought me here. The other piece that you should know about me is I've had a very atypical career. I got licensed in 2012 as a psychologist. From 2012 to 2020, I was doing primarily clinical work. But in 2015, I started an online business kind of as a side thing. I started a podcast. The podcast started very slow, but then exceeded a lot of what I could have ever imagined. It's currently, and the podcast is called Selling the Couch, and it's specifically for mental health providers. And it's sort of the intersection of business and psychology. So a lot of times I interview therapists about how they built their businesses and things like that. The podcast recently just passed 1.8 million downloads. It's an Apple Top Career podcast. And so I share all of these things because we're going to talk a lot about mental health, especially in kids, and social media is a huge part of it. And I often think I am so glad these things are happening at 42, because at 21, if some of these things had happened, I think I would have had no clue about how to handle all of these that come with it. So I wanted to at least just share that. The the nitty gritty, what I really wanted to do was start and share my story, because I just thought, what is the best way that we can have these conversations? So my family, I grew up in a very educated, highly accomplished family. As far as I know, my grandparents and my great grandparents in Kerala were all teachers. And I know for sure my paternal grandparents and my maternal grandparents moved to a very remote section of Kerala because they believed in the power of education and they wanted everyone to have equal access to education. And I know for all of us, especially in our careers as well as our kids, like how important education is. And so this is definitely not a conversation about like, have your kids strive less, any of those kind of things. It's more about trying to balance this thing, but also realizing there is a cost to accomplishment and how do you sort of find that balance of the two things. And so I graduated in 2000 from Louisville High School. I was ranked 18th out of 739 kids, which is, I think, the top 2%. I took AP classes all the way through. I was in multiple leadership positions. I went to Austin College, initially thinking I was going to go pre-med, wanted to become a pediatrician. I had an 80% of my tuition was paid there. I also had similar scholarship offers at UT Austin and SMU as well. So, but here's where it gets kind of crazy. My first year, I pulled a 2.9 GPA, and I had never struggled that much in my life, especially when it came to academics. There was a brief period in eighth grade when I got my first Algebra 1 exam. It was pretty bad, but I seemed to have picked it up. But prior to that, it was extremely hard. And the thing with me is, and I think for many kids, like I didn't party, I didn't do drugs, I didn't do anything like that. I wasn't with like bad peers. Honestly, I just going from a high school where I was doing really well to a university, which I'm sure many of you are thinking or have kiddos maybe at Austin College or thinking about it. If you could let us know in the chat, that would be awesome. For those of you that don't know, Austin College is usually a feeder school for a lot of pre-med kids, and so especially for med schools in Texas. So uh, what I think happened was one, the academics were just extremely rigorous. Two, I think looking back, this is the first time I ever left home, and trying to adjust to meeting new friends and all of those things was, I think, extremely hard. The other thing is, I think, you know, academics, I think I love to learn. I think academics came relatively easy to me, but I think what happened is I put a lot of my self-worth in academic accomplishments versus who I was as a person. And that I think is a very common pattern that I see among Desis in general, but I think among our kids especially. And so, uh, and I also didn't know how, there's all sorts of books now coming out, right? Like I think it's Angela Duckworth. She has a book called Grit, right? And Resilient. And I didn't know how to thrive after disappointment because I had never experienced it. And so, just to even give you a more of a real picture on this, I remember being at Austin College, and right outside, kind of, there's a pathway between the library and like kind of where the workout area is. And there was like this hill kind of behind it. And I remember like just one random Thursday night, I was feeling so dejected. And I mean, looking back, it was definitely clinical depression. I had some pretty intense thoughts of suicide. I never had experienced this in my life before. And I remember like going to the back of that hill and just praying to God, like, please, I feel like I failed. I felt like I failed my parents. I felt like I failed my community. I felt like, why did this happen? And I wanted to share. There was a moment where I thought, like, I had pretty intense thoughts of suicide, and I really thought that that thought of I would rather kill myself than disappoint my parents. Um, I remember distinctly feeling that. Um, and I wanted to share that because I imagine if your kiddos are, especially in a school like South Lake, it, I imagine if your kids are feeling that, they're probably maybe feeling some version of that. And so we we wanted to have more than anything an honest conversation. I told the team I'm just going to speak very briefly because honestly, I'm speaking first as a parent, second as a psychologist, and so what do we do? How do we navigate this? There's just a few things that I wanted to share with you. So one, you know, it's a weird system, right? At 14 to 18, right? Usually now you're preparing for college. At 18, you are somehow supposed to figure out what you're going to do for the rest of your life, right? But we know that brains don't fully develop until 25, and there's even research saying the brain continues to develop. So you're essentially pinning 17 or an 18-year-old trying to figure out what they should do for the rest of their life when their brain hasn't even fully developed, right? And so I just wanted to share three things and then also um, share some just kind of red flags to think about, especially related to depression, because the reality is, I don't have to tell any of you this. Depression rates and anxiety rates, especially post-pandemic, are skyrocketing, especially in kids and teens. Colleagues that I talk to, they're talking about 4 to 6 month wait lists just to see a mental health provider. I do feel like the research on this is we don't have a ton of research. I feel like especially in immigrant high achieving communities, this is magnified like to such a level that we truly don't have data. So three things I just wanted to share. One is what can we do as sort of high achieving immigrant parents? This is something again I think about. We have a 5-year-old, as I shared. I've got a PhD. My wife is an attorney. My dad is an immigration lawyer. My mom is a critical care nurse. My brother is a lawyer. My sister-in-law is a professor. Like there's a lot of achievement all around. And so how do we raise kids and how do we care for them and push them to who they can be, but also all the while taking care of them. So one, I see this a lot in our Indian community, which is we don't do the best at normalizing failure as parents. We don't talk about it. We don't, we almost hide it from our kids. And so when they fail, they themselves don't see us failing. And so they think this is a really bad thing, right? Just a question that you can ask your kids, a very simple one. It's hard, but ask them, what did they fail at today? This is something that we ask our 5-year-old now all the time. And the main reason is because I want her to understand failure is a normal process. It's actually, in fact, it's normal process of doing great things. I don't know how many of you know the story of like James Dyson, the Dyson vacuum. I think he had over 1,000 prototypes before the actual Dyson vacuum came. And so if he had just stopped at like the third or fourth one, we wouldn't have Dyson vacuums, right? And so the big thing to just remember is if we as parents don't talk about our failures or we shield our kids from failure when they're young, they won't have the skills or the resilience and or the grit to handle stuff when they're on their own, right? So we're not just teaching them skills for when they're in middle school or high school or college. This is impacting them as they become adults, right? How do they handle when they get fired at a job? How do they handle all of these things, right? And that's the real responsibility that we have. The second thing I would just share is EQ and IQ versus just IQ. So EQ is emotional intelligence. So we know this now in the workplace more than ever, right? That what makes outstanding leaders is not just IQ, right? It's actually this balance of both intellectual ability as well as emotional intelligence, the ability to connect and the ability to empathize, the ability to lead well, right? Um, it's also, I think, really true as we enter this world of AI. And I feel like this was like a side note. I just kept thinking, so many of us are now immersed in AI and thinking about how fast all of this is changing. And I feel like in the same way, mental health is the same. Like there's so much stuff we don't know yet. We have no idea the impact that COVID has had on these kids. We're starting to see it, but I feel like it's an entire generation that's going to be affected, you know? I mean, think about this. There was a period where our kids didn't go to school. They did Zoom calls, and we were usually working and then trying to do homework with these kids. you know. Our little one, she didn't have interaction, she didn't have significant interaction with her peers because of COVID. So five, like four or five was the first time she actually had peers because she's an only child. And so we just kept thinking like, how is she going to do with this? And so um, the big thing I just wanted to take away from this EQ IQ thing is, you know, there's a stat that recently came out in the last 2 weeks. They said 60% of the jobs that our elementary school kids will have don't exist now. That's a crazy stat, right? So 60% of the jobs that elementary school kids will have don't exist now. So that's how rapid things are changing. The other thing just to think about is I feel like especially our Indian culture, we really emphasize IQ, right? So even if you go in India, right, there's such a heavy emphasis on test scores, merit rankings, all of these kind of things, right? And in fact, your path in life and your path in career is often dictated by how well you do on a test in high school, right? The thing we just have to probably figure out the nuance of is as we come to this country and as we immerse here in the US, um, how do we sort of expand that from just this emphasis on IQ, right? But I think the big thing is we as parents often take that same mentality. If you don't get X amount of grades or you don't get into X amount of clubs, right, that means um, you have failed, right? Or a version of that. The third and final thing I would just say is praise the process versus the results. This is really, really hard and it's very nuanced, right? So I'm sure all of you are familiar with Khan Academy. There's a great TED Talk where he talks about how he models this in his kids, especially as Desis. I think most of our natural bent is to praise the result. Oh, you got an A today. You got president of this club. You did X on your recital, right? But the better thing, or at least the thing to add, is to actually praise the process, meaning praise them when they are willing to make that sacrifice and praise that process. Like, so for example, with our kiddo, and I speak as a parent because I don't think we have this all figured out at all, but we try to really emphasize, you know, our daughter's name is Chloe. So, and I'll say, Chloe, and I'm, from Kerala. So Kutta is our language and it's like baby girl or precious child, right? So we'll say, Chloe Kutta, like, I love how you are trying so hard at this, right? And I notice it at 5 years old, like how she lights up when her parents praise how hard she's working, right? Um, yeah. So the final thing I just wanted to say, a couple of red flags with depression because depression rates, especially among Indian kids, and anxiety rates as well are significantly increasing. I have this theory. I mean, again, I do feel like the more just generally more affluent communities are, and then the higher the academic standards are, I think there's probably a proportion of depression, anxiety in those. And so it looks a little bit different. For boys, it can often look like withdrawal or irritability or changes in behavior. Physical symptoms like stomach aches, increased aggression. For a lot of boys, something to think about is depression can often look like anger. So what is internally sadness can externally show up as anger. For girls, again, these are generalizations. There's often, unique things with every child, right? So for girls, a lot of it could be loss of interest, low self-esteem. Eating disorders, particularly in girls, are very high. And one way to think about eating disorders is on some level it is about like control, right? Being able to control what you put in your body, what you don't, and or what you if there's any sort of um if there's something like purging behavior like vomiting or anything like that, right? It's a way of controlling, right? And it's often because kids on their external world, they feel out of control, right? Maybe maybe it's a difficult family situation, maybe it's something in school, right? Generally for both difficulty concentrating, fatigue, thoughts of self-harm or suicide, a lot of social isolation, and then changes in school habits or extracurriculars. So you go from a kid that's really involved in sports and music and clubs and all this to like, no, I don't want to do that anymore. It's depression is, you know, as I shared, I started my undergrad in 2000, and so this will be 24 years of being in the world of psychology, and I feel like in many ways I know less now than when I first started because mental health is so complex. The brain is the one, organ that we know the least about, and we don't know why some of these things happen. We know with depression, there's genetic components. We do know that, it runs in families. Like in my family, I'm starting to have these conversations with my parents. We know anxiety runs in my family. We know depression runs in my family, right? We also know could be just trauma, things that happen in the house, things that happen at school, any of those things that can impact it as well. So uh, I think I covered everything, and so I wanted mainly to leave this time for Q&A and just talking because I think that's the most important thing we can do as a community. So
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Varghese. I think I've heard this statement many times. Vulnerability is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, right?
mm,
And I think the more we talk to our kids about it, like I have two teenage boys, and I keep talking about my failures because I've failed a lot and I've learned a lot. I think that we forget that we were kids sometime,
mm.
and I think that's the beauty of failures. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Reena Kopala. She's going to take over from here for handling all the questions that we get in chat. So please go around. Oh, you're on mute. Dr. Kopala, you're on mute.
Thank you, Meenu. Dr. Melvin, you gave us really very valuable insights, especially about the process you went through in college. And I'm sure like one of the most, something that caught like everyone's attention, you mentioned like one of the reason is being disappointed. They don't want to disappoint the parents, right? The parents' disappointment. How can we, as everyone, like even I have a teenage son, I think everyone has the same question. How do we assure them that they have to focus on the process and not on the results, like how you mentioned? And are there any techniques, or do you need to have a one-on-one with them, or do you need to talk to them in a group settings? How does it work?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think the most logical thing is kids and especially like kids are very visual, right? And so I think it really could be something as simple as like, for example, Rena, like you sit down, right? And you say, hey, look, I wanted to show you something because, this is something that happened this week, right? And this is something that didn't work out the way that I had hoped. Here's what I hoped, but it didn't work out this way. But here's where I think I learned, right? Here's what I think I learned about that. So I don't know if it's one technique. I think it's probably more of a shift in how we think about accomplishment and failure, right? Seeing it more as learning opportunities. I think the other thing, especially with kids, so I don't, I'm just trying to think of like a specific example. Like, let's say they got all district band or something, right? So instead of the question of like, that's so awesome that, you did this, you should definitely do that, right? But asking the question of like, that must have taken such amount of work to do that. Like, what did you learn about yourself through this? Right? It's such a subtle thing. I don't think it happens in one conversation, but if I'm just being honest with myself, and I think many of us here, if all of us, right, we've what we've accomplished and who we are has become like this,
Right.
right? And I think the more we can start to separate like who I am as a person is independent of what I accomplish, I think that's a real key.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Melvin. The next question we have is, how do we navigate social media influence with respect to self-awareness and depression in young minds?
Ooh, that's a really good one.
Yeah, it's a fully loaded one.
Yeah. So I'm sure all of you have seen the stats. Like, I think the most common thing that middle schoolers in high school want to be is YouTubers or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
Instagram influencers and
I mean,
YouTubers. Yeah.
yeah, TikTok, right? Can you say that question one more time? I just want to make sure I answer it correctly.
Sure. Sure. Like, how do we navigate social media influence with respect to self-awareness and depression in
Mm,
young minds? It need not be teenagers, even elementary, middle school, and high school. It's across the board, right?
yeah.
The impact of social media.
So I'm of the thing, like, I don't think social media is inherently bad, right? Like, it allows us to connect. Like, for example, like yesterday I was on Facebook and I saw one of my friends from high school and posted, I haven't seen it in 24 years, but it's nice that I'm one step removed, right? But at least can kind of see how they're doing. Um, there's a couple of practical things. This is, again, I'm speaking as a 42-year-old adult who's navigating this. I personally don't keep social media on my phone because I feel like, and the only time I log in is on my desktop because I noticed this was especially true with Instagram. Anytime you got that notification, right, you feel this ping of like, I got to go check,
Yes.
right? And what we know is like that sort of dopamine hit is really not good for our bodies, right? But most kids aren't going to know that, right? So the answer, right? The right answer would be don't let them have social media on their phone. But the truth is that's not going to happen, right? So I think the other conversation to have with them is what are like again, these aren't conversations that can, I think, happen like after you get off this call, but you want to start to ask them, what are you seeing on social media? Like, how does that impact how you think about yourself, right? What are your peers like? What are your friends like checking out, right? Social media does have a huge role. I don't know. I didn't cross check this, but I somebody told me that TikTok is now like one of the most, if the most popular search engine, which is pretty crazy that,
Right.
kids are getting information from social media.
But definitely, like, restricting them from social media is not the answer, right? But limiting
Yeah.
them is
Yeah.
okay.
Well, I think it's limiting and having conversations about it, right? Because
Mhm.
there's a whole world that I think, especially as parents, like if we close our eyes and they're doing all these things, but we can pretend like it's not happening, but it's happening, you know? And I think it's just better to kind of have these open and honest conversations. Again, because the way I think about it is it's really hard to have a conversation with, a 12 or 13-year-old about this stuff, right? But I would rather open up entryways to have that conversation so that when they're 42 or 52, we can have much more in-depth conversations about,
Yeah.
stuff that really matters. So,
Yeah, absolutely. The next question is, I think I want to tie this question to your personal experiences that you navigated as a student at UT Austin. So you did mention that you went through a phase of depression and loneliness, and you did have some thoughts. Um, when you had those thoughts, like, what was the first thing that you did? Like, did you approach the parents? I mean, as a person, like how you did, and then what is the right way to do it? You should approach your college counselors or your
yeah.
parents, or what's the right path to take?
Um, so what I did is I approached some of so at Austin College, I think many colleges do this. You have an RA, right? And you have like a pod, right? So I reached out to some of my friends. It was really hard to do that because again, Austin College is a very much a pre-med feeder school. And one of the things, and I'm really hoping has changed in the last 24 years, but I remember this feeling of like everybody was against each other, like nobody wanted to help you out, right? And that was not something I was really used to. But I reached out to my peers. I reached out to my RA, right? Um, One thing like my wife and I talk about again, we're, 13 years from this, but we often have questions on or conversations on this. If I were a parent in college, I would either tell them about the University Counseling Center, or I would go ahead and just have them schedule sessions there. Do it almost proactively. So most universities have university counseling centers. They're included in your tuition. So you're not, and so that's what I would do, because I wonder if I had started like even therapy sessions there. I wonder if like just having an outlet to talk about it, I think would have been helpful. What eventually happened is I think it got to a point where the suicidal thoughts were so intense. I told my mom and dad, and my mom and dad, I ended up meeting with a counselor through UT Southwestern. And so that counselor is what even shifted for me of like, oh my gosh, I felt it is so hard to describe it. Like to go from this place of deep darkness where I felt like I didn't know how to get out of this or my life was even worth it, to being able to talk to somebody and them to normalize like how hard it was. There was something, it's so hard because that was my first experience ever of counseling. And there's just a liberation that you felt, like a unburdening. And yeah, so I would say that's sort of how I
Yeah, that's
handle it.
that's the
So,
approach. Like, okay, so you suggest. What about like the approach a parents should take? Like, let's say, like some of the parents, if they observe that sort of behavior in the kids, so do you think they should confront the kids, or should they have or refer them to a counselor? How do you think is the right way to do it?
so I think confront probably won't. I mean, that's a
Okay.
hard word, right? That is a
Yeah,
hard
right,
word,
right,
right? Like,
right,
because, and the reality is most kids are going to probably hide it, right? From their parents,
right,
unless there's some real
right.
connection, right? So I think this is why I think having starting these conversations when they're in elementary, middle, and high school is so important, because you don't want to have these conversations as you're dropping them off for college, or if they're commuting, because you don't have the foundation set, right? But if that does happen, I think the thing to the thing that you can often do is, one, reinforce how proud you are of them, right? Regardless of their accomplishments, right?
Right.
Um, and always, I think the second thing I think a lot about this, let them know that this is always their home. They can always come to mom and dad, no matter
Yeah.
what is going on, right?
And it's okay to ask for help, whether it's
Yes.
with parents or whether it's with counselors, but ask for help,
Yeah, that it's
right?
okay,
Right.
that they're not a failure, right? Because I
Mhm.
think that's the other thing we were alluding to, right? In our
Right.
communities, I think there's so
Mhm.
much, because we also like,
Parents' disappointment. Yeah.
right. But our parents are also accomplished, right? Which then
Mhm.
it puts the barrier of what normal is like so
Mhm.
above normal, right?
Mhm.
So that's the other piece of it too.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do we do in a situation, right? Like when um, there are those symptoms and the kid refuses to get expert help, and there are some laws around it which does not
Yeah.
make it very easy. So
Yeah.
what should parents do under such circumstances?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the hardest things, right? When they get to be
Right.
18,
Mhm.
you don't have access to their medical records, any of those
Mhm.
kind of things, right? And so I think probably I mean, it's probably a multi-tiered approach is what I would recommend. So one is continuing to have conversations with them,
Mhm.
saying like, and I think part of it is we talked about the earlier thing of vulnerability, right? Like, I
Mhm.
think, I think in every one of our lives, every one of us here, right, we've had moments
Mhm.
of real heartache and disappointment, right? I think connecting it to that, right? So you modeling vulnerability, you saying, hey, when I was in college, my first class, I got an F on the exam, right? And uh, for my mom, like my mom wanted to go to med school, and um, I think she didn't meet, she scored really well, but she didn't, I always forget that term, but she didn't meet the cutoff because, um, certain seats are allocated, right? Based on like casts and all that kind of stuff, right? So when she started sharing that story of like even her disappointment, I think it made me connect with her in a different way, and I think especially as parents, sometimes we feel like we can't share those things because they'll feel some sort of way about us. But I think in most situations, what they're actually going to do is respect you even more.
Right, right. So sharing the journey and also having those conversations from a very young age would actually like help like mitigate this issue to some extent, right?
Right.
And usually when kids or teenagers, when they're depressed, right, there's a very slight how do I put this? There's a very gray area, right, between just having the regular swings versus having an actual depression, right?
Yeah.
So how do you address it? Like how can you tell like a kid is really depressed, or they're just anxious about their exams, or they're just like a moody in general in nature?
Yeah.
Like how do you like handle that?
Yeah. So whenever I assess for, or clinicians just generally assess for suicide, we look at ideation, intent, and plan. That's sort of the three areas. So ideation, intent, plan. So ideation is basically, are they having thoughts of suicide, right? So that itself is a range, right? It could be, I wish I were not around, or it could be like things would be way better, um, if I wasn't going through this, to I want to kill myself tomorrow, right? Right. So intent is the second part. So is this more of like passive thoughts? I forgot the exact stats, but I think something like 70 to 80% of us have had thoughts of death or something in that realm in our lifespan. So it's actually a very normal thing. I think it's so the ideation, the thoughts themselves are not the issue. I think it's the intent and the plan. So intent is basically, do these kids have a time frame of this? And then plan, right? Plan would be, do they have access to a gun? Do they have access to medication? Those kind of things. This is the hardest thing because I will be honest with you. I remember the first time I had to assess somebody in counseling for suicidal ideation. I was so nervous to ask the first three questions, and this is after, countless classes and countless, um, countless practice times. When in doubt, especially with suicide, I think sometimes parents feel like if I say something, it's going to put a thought in their mind of what to do, right? But I think the opposite is true, which is if they're feeling this, they've likely thought about it. And I think being really explicit, like, do you have a plan to kill yourself? Right? Like even using words like kill yourself, versus like harm yourself, right? Because it can always be mild. If you get it more pointed, it's definitely more uncomfortable. But I think it also lessens the power and it opens up dialogue, right? To be able to talk about it.
So you meant to say there's a gap between the initial ideation to actually doing it, right? Or
so no, it's more like ideation can range, but what we're really looking for is intent and plan.
intent. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other question I have, you did mention something about emotional intelligence, right? And I know that IQ, we can quantify it. And what about EI? Can we quantify that too? Or are there some tests, like even before we reach to a place where like, the kids are depressed, is there something that we can work on that? Or are there any tests out there?
That specifically test EQ or just like specifically get like a very
Not,
like
yeah, EI test, something that can be done.
yeah, there definitely are tests out there. So let me just take it. So specifically with depression, there's a range
Right.
of things,
Yeah.
right? There's like
Yeah.
BDI, BAI,
Right. Right.
like
Because you
depression
don't
inter.
want to wait for the symptoms, right? Yeah. Like most of the parents, they don't want to be
Yeah.
reactive, right?
Yeah.
Everyone wants to be proactive.
Yeah.
So what can we proactively do, like, to identify, like, are they ready? Like they do have like a high capacity of emotional intelligence. How do we do
Yeah.
that? How do we gauge that?
How do we gauge if they have high IQ?
Right.
Like, I mean,
Right.
EQ, basically.
Yeah.
So again, I think like a lot of this is with EQ, it's a lot of observation. And I think it's also shifting out of our own idea about what intelligence is. Right? Like, for example, like we're learning that IQ is actually just one part, is a one type of intelligence, right? There's kinesthetic intelligence, right? Some people who are exceptional dancers or exceptional sports, right? There's the ability, some are great writers, some are great artists, right? And so, but I think, and some have very high EQ, right? And so, how do you measure EQ? I think a lot of it's observation, like notice, right? So, for example, if your kid's in speech and debate, right? Our parents, our natural tendency would be like, how are they doing in speech and debate, right? But I think the EQ component is seeing how they tell stories, how they connect with people, right? Even seeing their social circle, like do people gravitate toward them, right? Those are like little markers, I think, of leadership and EQ and those kind of things.
Right. So during your conversation, you did also mention that depression is also genetic, right? So let's say, like, if it's genetic to at a single thread or something like that, how can we get the kids tested? So
Yeah, to see if
in that
that,
area, yeah, just to make sure, like, is it
yeah,
genetic or is it not? Because that's a bigger question that most of the parents have.
Yeah. So there's definitely genetic testing for depression, but it is super expensive. So I would not go down that path,
Okay.
just
Okay.
because I just don't think it's, and I think the
Perfect.
efficacy is
Okay.
like a little iffy on it.
Right.
The thing I would probably do is again start with conversations. Like one of the things that we're planning on having with our daughter at, when she gets of age, right? And this is like a lot of this is feeling out. We're gonna have a conversation about maybe like, just there's a history of depression in Dada's family, right? So we don't know like if you're gonna get that, if you're gonna feel that or any of that.
And you
We
don't want
really,
to put those thoughts in the kids, like, yeah, it's
yeah,
genetic. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, yeah, right. But we want to say like we really pray, it doesn't happen or any
Mhm.
of those, but we also want you to know that does happen. Mom and dad are here. We will help you through that. We don't ever want you to feel alone, right? So depression, I think this is the little nuance. If you've ever struggled with depression, you often feel like you're alone in it, right? And I think one of the best antidotes to it is letting folks know that they're not alone, right? That it's not something they have to handle by themselves, right?
Right. Right. My next question, Dr. Melvin, is why do you think Gen Z has a much higher rate of mental health issues when compared, like, to the previous generations?
Yeah, this I think is $1 million question.
The
I think it's
iPhone,
probably, yeah, well, yeah. So I mean, a lot of things, right?
social
iPhone
media.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think most of us, I grew up where I remembered my friend's phone number, right? And the only way we could talk to them was to actually use a
Yeah.
landline,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So these kids have, I mean, they basically have these things like right here, right? And we are, as parents struggle with this, right? Not like zoning out and looking at Instagram or whatever. And so phone, social media, I would say COVID definitely impacted a lot of stuff. I
COVID.
think social development, all of those kind of things. I think it definitely impacted. I think what we're starting to see now is there seems to be a like almost a rebound of like the social skills these kids lost when they were doing Zoom calls during COVID. It's like we're starting to
Mhm.
see the remnants of it now. Like they
Mhm.
feel more harder time interacting with other peers, harder time with like authority figures, feeling anxious around a
The
lot of
social
people.
interactions.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah, that, I mean, and then I think especially for our community, um, my wife's parents came in the 70s, you know, and I have this theory that I think parents that came in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, something shifted from the 70s to the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And I feel like it has gotten progressively more like my wife's parents, like we talk about this and they were, and my wife went to Villanova. She was a presidential scholar. She's an attorney. She went to Temple Law. She got into Georgetown as well. So she's very smart, very accomplished, but she often says, my parents never really pushed us to like do, which they told us to work hard and these things. But there's something that happened. I don't know what it is from, again, the 70s to the 80s and beyond, where it
Right.
just felt like the pressure got ratcheted up
It
as if
did. It
it
did.
almost
Yeah.
felt like survival.
Mhm.
Like, but
Yeah.
the weird thing is, it felt like we're pushing our kids to accomplish these things, but then we're also getting lost a little bit. Like how much of it is because we didn't accomplish something, or it's like our own, you know, like failings. And it's really interesting. I don't know the answer, but
Mhm.
it's just something I
Mm.
noticed. There's something that's happening, for sure, especially
Pushing
among,
the parents' dream onto the kids, you mean? Yeah.
Immigrants
yeah,
population, I think, exploded, Dr. Varghese.
yeah,
There were more of us with the same mindset
mm,
and then with the same thought process. I think
yeah,
when I came in 2000, it was always thriving, right? We're always
yeah,
trying to thrive. And
yeah,
I think that's the mentality, I think, that changed, because in 70s, the parents who came, they were just a small
yeah,
population,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Then we all grew and grew and grew, and we're all growing, which is great. But all of us are in the same boat.
yeah, yeah,
So
Yeah.
yeah.
My one more question for you, Dr. Melvin, is should we have some peer groups for kids? And would that help them, like if they don't want to share it with the adults? So how would, like, what do you suggest in that area? Like having a
100.
close knit of friends at school and everything
Yeah,
that would help?
100%. Like I think, in the
Hmm.
same way that we emphasize um, academics and music, right? We should really start emphasizing mental health. Like I call it mental wellness,
Okay.
because it's almost like a skill set that,
Hmm.
I mean, it's so helpful in the long term, right? But we don't
Right.
somehow, like a lot of times, like kids are supposed to figure that out. Oh, I'm a big advocate of, even if it is as early as like elementary school, having some sort of like peer group sort of conversations on this stuff, right? Because um, ultimately, it's not about the accomplishments, right? It's about giving them the skills when they fail,
Hmm.
right? Because that
How
is
to
going
cope
to,
with failures. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, because that's 100% going to happen. Even if you have a kid that's brilliant, right? There could be
Hmm.
another domain of life. Like, for
Right.
example, right? Maybe they don't get married at the age they're supposed to, or maybe
Right.
like we struggled with infertility for a number of years, right?
Right.
Right. So
Right.
I think that's why
Then
I
how do you think the parents should normalize failures? Like, what do you think? Like, and what do you do as, like, even you're a
yeah,
father, right? Like, how do you
yeah.
normalize the failures?
Um, this is the question I'm like, I feel like I'm still learning. I don't know that I fully,
Yeah.
uh, so one, I think talking about it, right? Like
Yeah.
we have regular conversations about, how did she fail? How did mom and dad fail? You know,
Hmm.
because again, we want to normalize
Hmm.
failure, right? So that's one thing. I think the other thing is, I think not this. I know we are all capable of it, right? But like, I think not putting all of our like unmet hopes and dreams on our kids,
Mhm.
right? That's
Right.
it's such a subtle thing, but it's so hard because many of us, like, we all have things that have happened to us in the past that have been really painful. And in a weird way, I think one thing I noticed, especially among a lot of Indian parents, is I wasn't able to accomplish this because of X circumstance. And now I'm going to make sure that my kid accomplishes that or never puts them into a situation. There's never a situation where that happens where they can't accomplish it.
Yeah, but
Right.
again, that's a very gray area, right,
It
Dr.
is.
Melvin, between
Oh,
like,
yeah. Yeah.
being very disciplined about it and
Yeah.
at the same time not being pretty hard on them, right? So it's
Yeah.
a pretty
Yeah.
like, very sensitive and it's like
Yeah.
walking on the eggshells, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was talking with a friend earlier in the week, and he's a dad too, Indian as well,
Mm,
and he was saying his uncle has this interesting perspective where he will like really push the kids when it comes to like studying and getting ready for exams, but during the exam time, he's like a
mhm.
giant teddy bear. Like
Right,
he is
right.
all about like, it's okay, like, we're gonna,
Mm,
and I don't know if that's the answer, but I do think some semblance of these two things, right? Both
right.
driving as well as saying like
Mm.
you're okay, like independent of what you accomplish, right?
Right, right. That's true. So I think we are like just 3 minutes away to end this session, and we have answered most of the questions. But I'll keep that last question pretty brief. But it's a pretty loaded question, I should say. What is the link between mental health and drugs?
Mm, it's a great question. So I wrote more of that on the sheet, but I think the the reality is it's complex, right? So we know, for example, that if some kids, right, or even some adults, right, when there's depression or anxiety, they can use drugs as a way of coping, right, with it. Right? There's also the other side of it, which is drug use can lead to mental health issues, right?
Ah,
So,
okay, okay.
right. So, for example, marijuana, we know marijuana is really interesting in that it's both a stimulant and a depressant, right?
Mhm.
And so if there's already a family or genetic predisposition to anxiety, and marijuana use, it's very possible it could trigger it, you know? Um, yeah. So it's not I know it's not like an easy answer, but I think it really does depend. Um,
Right, right. So it's a
the
double-edged sword. You get like,
Yeah.
it goes, it's bi-directional,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. The
Yeah.
one big one is with alcohol. I mean, I think most kids think like, oh, it just makes me feel good, but alcohol is actually a depressant, right? And so
Mhm.
once you hit that sort of that buzz, then
Mm.
it dips. And so that's something just like to be really thoughtful about and intentional about, especially if there's already like, because the common thing in college, right? I
Right.
remember this:
Hmm. Yeah,
exams, then go drink and go party, right?
right,
But if you're
right,
already struggling and you've got high with the low, that low can be intense,
right, right. Yep. Thank you so much, Dr. Melvin.
You're so welcome.
Over to you, Minu.
It was such a great session. Honestly, we're truly, truly grateful for your vulnerability and honesty, Dr. Melvin, as it's undoubtedly touched the hearts of everyone present here today, at least for me, and I'm sure Rena and everybody else who's here. Uh, your courage is speaking out as a person and as a, certified clinical psychologist. It makes a huge difference and very inspiring. Thank you, audience. I encourage you to carry forward the lessons learned, and thank you for the questions. I think they were really, really good questions, and thank you for the support for being here, because this is one of our first sessions and one of many, actually. So thank you once again, and to the wonderful people behind the scenes. A lot of work has gone into this Mind Matters. Just so you know, there's a lot of collaboration. Jay, Deepa, Kush, Reena, Anupam, myself, Dr. Varghese, you had a lot of sessions with him as well. So please take this as the first session and not the only session. And I think we all can make a difference in our kids' lives who are struggling with mental health, and we are all in this together. I just want to say that we all have our journey and our learning. So let's help and uplift each other. And that's what I wanted to say. So take care. Until next time, thank you so much. And closing off. Bye-bye.